Welcome back to Great Northwest Weaponry. This is Thomas, and today we're taking a look at an awesome piece. This is my most recent gun acquisition from my friends at the Warfront. Colt US Army Model 1911, dated 1918. So this is a World War I example, and it is in unaltered 1918 condition. This is just a creme de la creme of my collection thus far. We're going to be going into the gun room here in a minute to talk history. I know everybody and their dog has done demos on the 1911s, so I think we're going to kind of just do a general overview and then talk about the use of the 1911 in World War I specifically. So stay tuned.
Before we dig too much into this, I have to state again very clearly, there is nothing I can say about the 1911 that hasn't been said a million times. I'm going to try and present, my own take on it and approach it from maybe a less directly talked about angle, but giving the general history of the 1911 is not going to be anything that you haven't probably heard presented in some form or another before if you regularly watch gun channels. That being said, the legendary Colt Model 1911 was a design of John Moses Browning, officially to replace the Model 1905, as this was basically a weaker 1911. There was a few things changed from the 1905 to 1911, but basically the 1905 was chambered in 38 ACP or 380 auto, and the U.S. government had already experimented with 38s. See the line of Colt DA-38 New Army revolvers. These were not liked by the people who used them, largely because they were using them against Moreau fighters in the Philippines to not enough effect. So the Army did adopt a 38 semi-automatic pistol, but decided they didn't like 38 in 1906, so the following year, and that they wanted more stopping power. And that is pretty much the claim to fame of the 1911, is the stopping power. It's not really an unfounded claim. It would be proven time and time again in the short range to be a very effective round, though in longer range, it actually doesn't have as much penetration as 9mm. But in the short range, it definitely would, stop a man dead in his tracks, especially if you put more than one in him. I'd actually heard the phrase thrown around, "they all fall to hardball," which is a reference to 45 ACP in the 1911 specifically. The Army would officially adopt the 1911 on March 29th of 1911. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps would follow in 1913. And then you have World War I, the outbreak of the Great War. The U.S. Army didn't actually get involved for quite some time, but started, boosting arms production incrementally. But by the time the U.S. Army did get involved in World War I, there were about 75,000 total Colt Model 1911s. Contracts would be given out to multiple other companies as demand exploded for the gun. So you'd have Colt, Savage, Remington, and Springfield producing the 1911 for the remainder of World War I. From what I can find, Colt was contracted for 500,000, and they got pretty close to completing this contract. 412,114 exactly were made up to the end of the war, for a total of 487,714. So they weren't exactly rare, but they were outnumbered in the field pretty substantially by the model of 1917 revolver. We've talked about this at length, as I've had this for quite a while. This one is a Smith & Wesson. Colt also made them. I don't remember the exact ratio, but it was at least 2-to-1 revolvers to 1911s in the field during World War I. And this is definitely going to be something that's going to have to happen here, is a face-off between these two. We all know the 1911 is going to win, but I do wonder, with the moon clips and only one round less capacity, just how substantial it's going to be. The 1911 being single action for every shot will definitely help, as you don't have to do that to get your single action shot. But regardless, it's definitely something we're going to explore. I've had a kind of hard time finding an exact number of 1911s made across all brands throughout World War One. I've seen the number of 1 million thrown around a bit. For Colt, it was just shy of 500,000, basically. So they would gain quite a bit of notoriety throughout the war, as would American soldiers in general, actually. So the 1911 was issued directly to officers, NCOs, and then other specific kind of niche jobs within the military, such as vehicle drivers, mortar crews, machine gunners. These would often have 1911s, but the average soldier did often try to get their hands on them, or another pistol in lieu of a 1911 if they couldn't get one of those. So the Germans, I've actually seen this written, thought of Americans as these crazy cowboys that came in rootin' and tootin' with a whole bunch of guns per man, whereas the Germans, the average, had one gun. But the 1911 would prove extremely effective in the trenches. Again, at close range, 45 ACP does absolutely pack a wallop. Again, they all fall to hardball. It was less affected by things such as mud and dust than the Luger P08 was, as the Luger is very tight tolerances and all hand machined. A little bit of dust can stop the Luger dead. Not really the case with the 1911. The original test gun, the number of rounds fired through it was pretty shocking. I'm not going to say it offhand because I'm probably going to get it off by a decimal. 6,000 would be the low one. It could have been 60,000, but I think it was maybe 6,000 rounds. So there we go. I did state it. I just lied to you all. I said I wouldn't state it, and I just did. But so whatever the number was, every time the gun would get hot, they'd just dunk it in water and keep going, and that gun made it through the whole test. That is a pretty brutal way to test a gun, especially in the 19 teens. Metallurgy wasn't what it is today. But another instance that would show the worth of the 1911, and this is my favorite topic to talk about, is Sergeant Alvin C. York. Talked about him at length when we did the demo of my Winchester Model 1917. Alvin York carried the 1917 and the 1911. Contrary to the movie, where he carries a 1903 and I think a Luger, if I'm not mistaken. If that's the case, we're doing a Sergeant York real life versus movie face-off at some point. I'm going to look a little farther into that and confirm, but I think in the movie it was a 1903 and a Luger P08, and that would just be a weird matchup that I kind of want to do. But anyway, Sergeant York killed at least 20 Germans with, and that's single-handedly, I might add. So he had 7 men with him. There were 17 to begin with total, him included. 9 were cut down instantly by machine gun fire at the Meuse-Argonne offensive, date October 8th, 1918. Got notes sitting in my lap, so having to reference them every now and then. There's a lot of dates I'm throwing around here. But anyway, 17 men, 9 got cut down right off the bat, and this left Sergeant York in charge, as his commanding officer was one of the men cut down. I don't actually think he was a sergeant until after these events either. But anyway, continuing with the story, Sergeant York individually killed at least 20 Germans, the last 6 of which while charging with fixed bayonets with his 1911, of which would be really a endorsement of the 1911 in many ways, because Sergeant Alvin York, if you are somehow not aware, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. The moment that he drew his pistol and started dropping bodies was the moment that the German garrison commander decided that it was a lost cause. He thought that they were facing a superior force because every wave that he sent up after this American, whatever unit size he thought it was, he kept on sending soldiers out after them, and they just kept on being cut down. And the last wave of them got to within pistol range. York dropped 6. Garrison commander surrenders. After a few other scattered surrenders, York and his 7 men captured 132 German soldiers. 132 laid down their arms to a total of 8 men, and this is why he won the Medal of Honor. We're not going to go deep into the further history of the 1911, but suffice it to say that it was like 1.9 million were made for World War II after they'd been upgraded in 1921 to the 1911 A1. the version of the gun of which would be used by the U.S. military all the way until 1985. I think 1986 is when they were officially phased out by the Beretta M9. And even then, they continued being used by different military organizations within the U.S. for an extended period of time beyond that. They've never really went away. For about 100 years, the 1911 was lauded as like the great American firearm. Now is where I'm going to crap all over something that you hear all the time from 1911 enthusiasts, though. 2 world wars. The 1911 did not individually win either world war. It was but a tiny fraction of soldiers killed in combat that were killed by pistols in any capacity. World War I artillery did the vast majority of all damage. It was mechanized warfare. World War II, you got tanks and planes and bombs and nukes and the M1 Garand, the greatest battle implement ever designed, as stated by, I think it was Patton, but the 1911 played a small role. It was present for 2 world wars, yes, but when a FUD tries to tell you that either world war was won by the 1911, please feel free to laugh at that man and then tell me about it in the comments below. I would like to hear your 2 world wars stories, because I've got a couple myself. Like, I don't know how many times I've been into a gun shop asking about, like, hey, what do you got that's good? Like, I don't know everything about guns. I like to hear, different people's opinions. And whoever the oldest guy is behind the counter is going to bring out a 1911 and go, this gun here won 2 world wars. It didn't. It just objectively did not win 2 world wars. It did not win either. It was, however, one of the best designs of its time. It stuck around, honestly, longer than it should have, but it is still viable. Like, if not for the fact that I have an issue with this one's slide not locking open, of which I think is just the mag. I'm actually going to check on that here shortly. By shortly, I mean in this video, we're going to be checking on this, because the intention is from here, I'm going over to the war front to look at the slight differences between early and end of World War I 1911s, because this is a 1918 dated example, and my friend Drew at the war front has a 1914. So we're going to look at some of the tiny differences over that period of time, and I'm going to stick his mag in my gun and see if it locks open. If it does, then it's a magazine problem. Easy fix, just get a new mag. And if it's not the mag, then it's just the locking lever must have worn a bit of the metal and isn't catching. So, knocking stuff over. And we've got an original World War II holster. This is actually the same pattern, basically, that they would use in World War I. But from my understanding, the belt slot on the back is really the only major difference. But this is a 1943 Boyd U.S. military holster for the 1911. They also, in World War II, often would be carried in a chest rig, but that would be more so for tank crews. Again, we're not going to get too much into the 1911 A1, because I really want to have one of those in my collection someday. And there's a lot more history to go over with 1911s. This is by no means a fully comprehensive video on it. I could do a deep dive on just the development of the gun and the 5 years over which it was designed to replace the Model 1905. But that's been done repeatedly. So I'm sticking with the military usage of this specific model of 1911, the US M1911, pre-1911 A1. But yeah, it's such a cool piece. A lot of cool history behind it. One of the most iconic firearms in American history, probably by far the most iconic pistol. Yeah, with that, again, the intention is we're going to go over to the war front to do our tabletop segment here. So, be taking a look at markings, minor differences between early and late World War I examples, and field strip. Okay, so we are at the war front. Got on the right here my 1918, and on the left, this is Drew's 1914, dated Colt 1911. Both are Colt examples. There are a couple of things that changed between 1914 and 1918. A lot of them are very subtle. a lot of it is markings. So for one, the earlier examples, you'll see your United States property stamp is on the left side of the frame, up near the front on the bottom, right there, tip of my finger. On a later 1918 example, I actually moved it to the other side, right above the serial number at the tip of my finger there, tip of my thumb, I guess. Also, location of the Colt. So you see it's in the middle of the legend on my later example, and on the earlier example, it's actually back behind the slide serrations. A lot of the other stuff, again, is very minor. So for one, you'll see on the safety, it's got this raised edge there on the earlier example, whereas that was smoothed out in the 1918 example. And the finish definitely changed a bit, and that's probably more or less a wartime thing. So a lot darker bluing. Actually, I'll move these into frame a little better. Much darker bluing on the left than on the right. And again, the right is the later example. Also, the mags evolved. So earlier on, you'd have these two-tone mags, and a number of these two-tone mags would have your lanyard loop on the bottom. Later examples, single tone, still blued, and a lot of the bluing on this example is thin, but it's still there. But we had also mentioned that my gun does not lock open on an empty mag. And you can see right there, there's resistance. That is where it should be locking. Now we're gonna try the different mag. Make sure that it is the mag and not the gun. Just to also prove real quick that I didn't just reach up with my thumb there, I'll show you a straight on view. So it is definitely my mag and not my gun. Now, I think that's about all that we're going to cover on that aspect. So the next thing to do is disassembly. And with 1911s, this is a little bit of a pain, and you definitely want to be careful with certain part of the reassembly that you don't scratch. But the first thing that we're going to want to do is depress this here little lug that holds in your recoil spring, and then rotate the bushing out of the way and let this out. You want to be very careful. This will go flying if you are not careful with it. So depress, rotate, covering with my hand so I don't lose anything, and there we go. Pull that free. The recoil spring is retained by the guide rod. Set that aside. Pull out our bushing. You want it at the angle seen there, about like so, to get it out. Now, I'm going to pull the slide back, and there should be no spring tension once the gun is cocked. The only spring tension is going to be from the hammer itself. So once the gun is cocked, you can pull the slide back to right there. You see that notch in the slide is lined up with that lever. You can push on that lever from this side to pop it out. So push, grab, and extract. And now the slide and all internals are free. What we got? Recoil spring and guide rod. And then the barrel just slides straight out. And this eye, when you put the gun back together, should be lined up so that your retaining piece here goes straight into it from the side. So you have to kind of be mindful of that. It'll be lined up with that hole right there. Now bring it all back together. Barrel, actually, forgot. Going through this way. Barrel in. Spring goes in from this side. And you're going to want to rotate that foot onto the barrel. Make sure that that is oriented the correct direction. And now we're going to put the frame onto the slide, and we're going to keep it upside down so nothing falls out of place. And all this is going to kind of move around inside there. That is fine. Now, guide this back to where that notch is back where it should be. Make sure that our oh, there we go. Again, you should see daylight through there. If you don't, then something's not lined up properly. This is where you want to be careful not to scrape
this part around, because you could leave a huge scar on here. And a lot of people do. You see a lot of people doing that, and it just kind of makes me sad. Pop it all the way in. Now, slide forward. And now we're going to have to finagle this thing. If you push too hard, you'll knock the slide out of battery. But you can put that in. Actually, first we're going to insert the bushing. Now we're going to push this down, and I'm kind of be covering this with my hand so it doesn't go flying once again. We're going to push this down and then rotate the bushing into place once it is past it. Bada boom. All is well. Let's go ahead and take this one back up to the range. Put a note 7 through it.
Loading the 1911 is dead simple. Got a 7-round mag, just insert to the bottom. Thusly, there's a button release. This, again, you know, this functions much like 90% of all modern handguns. It's a manual safety. Here you actually have to have the gun loaded with one in the chamber to engage the manual safety. And yeah, go ahead and take this next 7 shots here. This should lock open. We've addressed this already. It does not on this example, so it is very empty. Again, it's 105 years old. Cool trick with 1911s, you do not have to hold in the grip safety and pull back the hammer to drop the hammer. You can just pull the hammer all the way back, and you can see right there, it actually depresses the grip safety on its own. So you can just pull back, pull trigger, and guide forward. So, neat little trick that not a lot of people know how to do. Anyway, hope you all enjoyed the video. I certainly enjoyed shooting it. I will take any chance to fire the 1911. It is just, it's my favorite. So, anyway, thanks for watching Great Northwest Weaponry. See you all next time.